The morning sun cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured gardens of Windsor Castle as Sergeant Thomas Mitchell adjusted his crimson uniform for the final time. After 15 years of loyal service to the royal family, today would mark his last day as a member of the Queen's Guard. The decision hadn't come easily, but recent events had left him with no choice but to tender his resignation. Thomas had always taken pride in his role as one of Prince George's personal protection officers. The young prince, now 11 years old, had grown from a curious toddler into a bright and inquisitive boy who never failed to surprise those around him. Thomas had watched him take his first steps in the palace corridors, witnessed his first day of school, and had been there through countless family gatherings and public appearances. The relationship between a royal protection officer and their charge was supposed to be professional, distant and strictly regulated. However, over the years, Thomas had developed a genuine fondness for the young prince. George was different from what many expected of a future king. He was kind to the palace staff, curious about the world beyond the castle walls, and possessed an unusual sensitivity that often caught adults off guard. It was this very sensitivity that had led to the incident that would change everything. 3 weeks ago, during a routine morning walk through the castle grounds, Prince George had noticed something that would set in motion a chain of events that nobody could have anticipated. The day had started like any other. Thomas had collected George from his private tutoring session and was escorting him to the stables where the prince enjoyed spending time with the horses. As they walked along the cobblestone path, George suddenly stopped and pointed toward one of the groundskeeper's cottages, nestled among the oak trees. "Sergeant Mitchell," George had said in his clear, young voice, "and why is that man crying?" Thomas had followed the prince's gaze to see Harold Pembridge, the head groundskeeper, sitting on his cottage steps with his head in his hands. Harold had worked at Windsor for over 30 years and was known for his cheerful disposition and meticulous care of the castle grounds. To see him in such obvious distress was unusual. "Perhaps he's just tired, Your Highness," Thomas had replied, gently trying to guide the prince away. "We should continue to the stables." But George had other ideas. Before Thomas could stop him, the young prince had walked directly toward Harold's cottage, his small figure moving with the determination that royal children seem to possess naturally. Thomas had no choice but to follow, his trained eyes scanning for any potential security concerns while trying to respect the prince's obvious intent to help. "Are you all right, Mr. Pembridge?" George had asked softly, his voice carrying a maturity that belied his years. Harold had looked up, startled to see the young prince standing before him. He had quickly wiped his eyes and attempted to stand, but George had gently gestured for him to remain seated. "Your Highness, I'm quite well, thank you," Harold had stammered, clearly embarrassed to be seen in such a state. But George had possessed an intuition about people that often amazed the adults around him. He had sat down on the step beside the groundskeeper, ignoring Thomas's subtle attempts to maintain proper protocol. "My grandmother says that sometimes when we're sad, it helps to talk to someone," George had said simply. "Would you like to talk to me?" The conversation that followed would haunt Thomas for weeks to come. Harold, overwhelmed by the prince's genuine concern and kindness, had broken down and shared his troubles. His wife of 40 years had been diagnosed with a serious illness that required expensive treatment not covered by his palace employment benefits. Despite his decades of service, Harold was facing the possibility of losing his home to pay for his wife's medical care. What happened next would be the moment that changed everything. Prince George had listened intently to Harold's story, asking thoughtful questions and showing a level of empathy that was remarkable for someone so young. When Harold had finished speaking, George had done something that went against every protocol Thomas had been trained to uphold. The young prince had reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch that contained his personal allowance money. Without hesitation, he had placed it in Harold's hands and said, "Please take this for Mrs. Pembridge's medicine." Harold had tried to refuse, explaining that he couldn't possibly accept money from the prince. But George had insisted with a quiet authority that reminded Thomas of the Queen herself. The amount wasn't significant by royal standards, but the gesture was profound. Here was a future king, still a child, showing genuine compassion and a willingness to help those in need. Thomas had watched this exchange with growing unease. While he admired the prince's kindness, He knew that such actions, however well-intentioned, could have serious implications. Royal protocols existed for important reasons, and unauthorized financial transactions, even small ones, could create complications that extended far beyond the castle walls. The incident had left Thomas in an impossible position. His duty as a protection officer required him to report any unusual behavior or protocol breaches to his superiors. However, reporting George's act of kindness felt like a betrayal of the trust the young prince had shown by allowing Thomas to witness his compassionate nature. For days, Thomas had wrestled with his conscience. He had served the royal family faithfully for over a decade, but he had also grown genuinely fond of Prince George. The thought of potentially getting the young prince in trouble for showing kindness to a palace employee went against every instinct Thomas possessed as both a protector and a human being. The situation had become even more complicated when George had begun asking Thomas about Harold's wife, wanting to know if she was feeling better and whether there was more they could do to help. The prince's continued concern showed that his initial gesture hadn't been a mere impulse but reflected a genuine desire to make a positive difference in someone's life. As Thomas stood in his quarters on this final morning, carefully folding his uniform, he reflected on the choice he had made. He had decided that he couldn't continue in his role while keeping such a significant secret from his superiors, nor could he bring himself to report an act of pure compassion that showed the very best qualities a future monarch could possess. The irony wasn't lost on him that Prince George's kindness, the very quality that would likely make him an exceptional king someday, was the same quality that had forced Thomas to end his career with the Royal Guard. Sometimes, he reflected, doing the right thing came with a price that nobody anticipated. The news of Sergeant Thomas Mitchell's sudden resignation spread through the palace corridors like wildfire. Staff members whispered in hushed tones during their tea breaks, wondering what could have prompted such an experienced and respected guard to leave his position without warning. The official statement from the Royal Protection Command was brief and unrevealing, mentioning only that Sergeant Mitchell had chosen to pursue other opportunities. Commander Sarah Halifax, head of Prince George's protection detail, found herself facing uncomfortable questions from her superiors about the sudden departure of one of their most trusted officers. Thomas had submitted his resignation letter on a Tuesday morning, requesting immediate release from his duties. Such abrupt departures were highly unusual in the Royal Protection Service, where officers typically gave months of notice to ensure proper transition procedures. The timing couldn't have been worse. The royal family was preparing for several high-profile public engagements, including a state visit from the Prime Minister of Australia and Prince George's first official solo appearance at a children's charity event. The loss of an experienced protection officer created logistical challenges that rippled through the entire security apparatus. Prince George noticed Thomas's absence immediately. During his morning routine, he had looked around expectantly for the familiar figure in the crimson uniform, but instead found himself accompanied by Sergeant Jennifer Walsh, a capable but unfamiliar officer who had been hastily reassigned to fill the gap. "Where is Sergeant Mitchell?" George had asked directly, his young face showing genuine concern. "He's no longer with us, Your Highness," Sergeant Walsh had replied carefully. "I'll be taking care of your security from now on." The prince had fallen quiet after this exchange, something that didn't go unnoticed by his tutors and other staff members. George was typically an engaged and talkative child, but over the following days he seemed distracted and withdrawn. His governess, Mrs. Eleanor Fitzwilliam, mentioned to the Queen that the prince appeared to be troubled by something, though he hadn't shared what was bothering him. Meanwhile, Thomas was experiencing his own period of adjustment. After 15 years of structured palace life, where every day was planned and every movement had purpose, he found himself adrift in civilian life. He had taken a small flat in London and was considering his options for employment, but the transition proved more difficult than he had anticipated. The weight of his secret continued to burden him. He had left his position to avoid having to report Prince George's spontaneous act of charity, but he wondered whether his departure had actually made the situation worse. His absence might draw more attention to the events leading up to his resignation, potentially causing the very scrutiny he had hoped to avoid. Back at Windsor Castle, Commander Halifax was conducting her own quiet investigation into Thomas's departure. She had worked with him for 8 years and knew him to be dedicated and reliable. His sudden resignation didn't align with his character, and she suspected there was more to the story than what appeared in his brief resignation letter. During her investigation, Halifax discovered that Thomas had been the officer on duty during several recent incidents involving Prince George, including the morning walk that had taken them near the groundskeeper's cottages. She began interviewing other staff members who might have witnessed unusual behavior or conversations. Harold Pembridge, the head groundskeeper, found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. Prince George had continued to ask about his wife's health during their brief encounters around the castle grounds, and Harold was touched by the young prince's ongoing concern. However, he was also aware that accepting money from a member of the royal family, even a small amount given with the best intentions, could be seen as highly inappropriate. Harold's wife, Margaret, had indeed been receiving treatment for her illness, and the extra money had helped cover some of the costs that their insurance didn't address. However, both Harold and Margaret were troubled by the ethical implications of the situation. They had discussed returning the money, but Harold worried that doing so might offend the young prince, who had clearly acted from genuine kindness. The situation became more complicated when Commander Halifax approached Harold during her investigation. She was asking routine questions about any unusual incidents or conversations involving Prince George and his protection officers. Harold found himself faced with the same dilemma that had troubled Thomas, whether to reveal the prince's compassionate but protocol-breaking gesture. Has Prince George had any interactions with you or your family recently, Mr. Pembridge? Halifax had asked during their conversation in the garden. Harold had hesitated, torn between his loyalty to the prince who had shown such kindness to his family and his obligation to answer his superior's questions honestly. The prince is always very polite when he sees me, ma'am. A lovely young man, very considerate. Has he ever given you anything or asked you to do anything unusual? Halifax had pressed, sensing there was more to learn. The direct question left Harold with little room to maneuver. He had always prided himself on his honesty, but he also felt a deep sense of protection toward Prince George, who had acted purely from goodness of heart. Well, ma'am, Harold had said carefully, His Highness did show concern about my wife's health when I was having a difficult day. Very thoughtful of him it was. Halifax had noted Harold's carefully chosen words and the way he seemed to be weighing each response. Her years of experience had taught her to recognize when someone was being truthful but incomplete in their answers. Prince George, meanwhile, was dealing with his own sense of loss and confusion. He missed his conversations with Thomas, who had always treated him with respect while also helping him understand the responsibilities that came with his position. The new protection officer was professional and competent, but she lacked the easy rapport that George had enjoyed with Thomas. More troubling to the young prince was his growing worry about Harold and his wife. During their brief encounters, Harold seemed increasingly anxious, and George began to suspect that his attempt to help might have created problems rather than solving them. The thought that his actions might have caused difficulties for people he cared about weighed heavily on his young mind. The palace staff had also begun to notice changes in the atmosphere. The departure of a respected colleague like Thomas had created an undercurrent of uncertainty and speculation. Some wondered if there had been a security breach or incident that hadn't been disclosed. Others speculated about possible personal issues that might have prompted his sudden exit. Queen Elizabeth herself had been briefed about Thomas's resignation, though the details provided to her were minimal. As someone who had worked with protection officers for decades, she understood that such departures usually indicated either personal problems or professional complications. She made a mental note to have a conversation with Commander Halifax about ensuring the security. Arrangements around her great-grandson remained seamless during the transition. The ripple effects of Thomas's decision were spreading far beyond what he had anticipated when he made his choice to resign, rather than report Prince George's spontaneous act of charity. What had begun as a simple gesture of kindness between a prince and a groundskeeper was now affecting multiple lives and raising questions throughout the palace hierarchy. 2 weeks after Thomas Mitchell's departure, Prince George made a decision that would surprise everyone around him. During his weekly private audience with Queen Elizabeth, a tradition she maintained with all her great-grandchildren, to discuss their education and personal development, George chose to break his silence about the events that had been troubling him. The Queen's private study was a comfortable room filled with personal photographs, books, and the gentle ticking of antique clocks. It was here that she had countless conversations with family members over the decades, offering guidance and listening to concerns both great and small. Prince George had always looked forward to these meetings, where he could speak freely with his great-grandmother away from the formal protocols that governed most of his interactions. "Granny," George had said, using the informal title the family used in private, "I think I might have done something wrong, and it might have hurt someone I care about." Queen Elizabeth had looked up from the papers she was reviewing, immediately giving her great-grandson her full attention. At 11 years old, George was reaching an age where his understanding of right and wrong was becoming more sophisticated, and she recognized the serious tone in his voice. "Tell me what's troubling you, George," she had said gently, setting aside her work completely. What followed was George's complete account of his encounter with Harold Pembridge, his decision to give the groundskeeper money for his wife's medical treatment, and his growing concern that this action might have caused problems for Harold, and possibly contributed to Sergeant Mitchell's sudden departure. The Queen listened without interruption, her expression remaining neutral as George explained his reasoning for helping Harold and his subsequent worries about the consequences. When he finished speaking, there was a moment of silence as she considered the complexity of the situation her great-grandson had presented. "George," she had said finally, "can you tell me why you felt you needed to help Mr. Pembridge?" "Because he was sad, and I could help," George had replied simply. "When someone is hurting and you can make it better, shouldn't you try?" The Queen had recognized in her great-grandson's words an echo of the values she had tried to instill in her family throughout her reign: duty, service, and genuine care for others. However, she also understood the complexities that his well-intentioned action had created. "Your heart was in the right place, George," she had told him, "but sometimes, even when we want to help, there are proper ways to do things that protect everyone involved." George had nodded solemnly, clearly understanding that his actions, while kind-hearted, had created complications he hadn't anticipated. "Did I get Sergeant Mitchell in trouble? Is that why he left?" The Queen had promised to look into the situation, and true to her word, she had requested a private meeting with Commander Halifax that same afternoon. The conversation that took place in her office would prove to be pivotal in resolving the growing crisis. Commander Halifax had entered the meeting prepared to discuss routine security matters, but the Queen had immediately directed the conversation toward Thomas Mitchell's resignation and any unusual incidents involving Prince George. "Need you to tell me exactly what happened in the days leading up to Sergeant Mitchell's departure," the Queen had said with the directness that came from decades of cutting through bureaucratic complications. Halifax had initially tried to downplay the situation, suggesting that Mitchell's resignation was likely due to personal reasons. However, the Queen's penetrating gaze and follow-up questions made it clear that a more complete explanation was required. "Your Majesty," Halifax had said carefully, "I believe there may have been an incident involving Prince George and one of the castle staff members. Sergeant Mitchell may have been aware of this incident and was possibly conflicted about how to handle it according to protocol." The Queen had nodded, confirming that her suspicions about the connection between George's story and Thomas's departure were correct. She had then made a decision that demonstrated both her wisdom and her understanding of the delicate balance between royal protocol and human compassion. "Commander Halifax," she had said, "I want you to arrange a private meeting with Mr. Pembridge. I believe we need to address this situation directly and appropriately." The meeting with Harold Pembridge took place the following day in Commander Halifax's office. Harold had entered nervously, unsure why he had been summoned but suspecting it might be related to his interactions with Prince George. Halifax had approached the conversation with sensitivity, explaining that they were aware of the prince's gesture of kindness and wanted to ensure that everyone involved was comfortable with how to proceed. Harold had been relieved to finally be able to speak openly about what had happened, and he expressed his deep gratitude for Prince George's concern while also acknowledging his discomfort with the situation. "Your Highness is a wonderful young man," Harold had told Halifax, "but I've been losing sleep over this. It doesn't feel right accepting money from him, even though he meant it so kindly." Halifax had assured Harold that no one was in trouble, and that they simply wanted to find a way to honor Prince George's generous spirit while maintaining appropriate boundaries. Together they had developed a plan that would address the prince's desire to help while following proper procedures. The solution they crafted was both elegant and appropriate. The royal family maintained several charitable funds, specifically designed to assist palace employees and their families during times of hardship. Harold's situation clearly qualified for assistance from these funds, and the help could be provided through proper channels without creating ethical complications. Moreover, Halifax suggested that Prince George could be involved in the process by writing a formal recommendation for Harold to receive assistance from the Employee Hardship Fund. This would allow the prince to help Harold's family while learning about the appropriate mechanisms that existed within the royal system for providing aid to those in need. When this solution was presented to Prince George during another meeting with his great-grandmother, his relief was evident. He was delighted to learn that there were established ways to help people in situations like Harold's, and he was eager to write the recommendation letter that would support Harold's application for assistance. The Queen had used this as a teaching moment, explaining to George that his impulse to help others was admirable and should be encouraged, but that as a member of the royal family, he would need to learn to channel that impulse through appropriate systems and procedures. Being royal doesn't mean caring less about people, she had told him. It means learning to care for them in ways that are sustainable and protect everyone involved. George had absorbed this lesson eagerly, understanding that his position came with both opportunities and responsibilities. The formal recommendation letter he wrote for Harold was thoughtful and heartfelt, demonstrating both his genuine concern for the groundskeeper's family and his growing understanding of how to exercise his influence appropriately. The Employee Hardship Fund approved Harold's application quickly, providing assistance that covered his wife's medical expenses without creating any ethical complications. Harold was profoundly grateful, both for the practical help and for the way the situation had been handled with dignity and respect for all involved. However, one significant question remained unanswered: what to do about Thomas Mitchell, whose resignation had been motivated by his desire to protect Prince George from the consequences of his compassionate but protocol-breaking gesture. The question of Thomas Mitchell's future became the central focus of several high-level discussions within the palace hierarchy. Queen Elizabeth had been deeply moved by Prince George's account of how Thomas had handled the delicate situation, showing both discretion and genuine care for the young prince's well-being. The fact that Thomas had chosen to resign rather than potentially embarrass or create difficulties for George spoke to a level of loyalty that the Queen found both admirable and troubling. Commander Halifax had conducted a thorough review of Thomas's personnel file and service record. His 15 years with the Royal Protection Service had been exemplary, with commendations for his professionalism, reliability, and particularly his skill in working with younger members of the royal family. Previous supervisors had consistently noted his ability to balance security requirements with the need to allow royal children some degree of normal childhood experiences. Sergeant Mitchell's record is impeccable, Halifax reported to the Queen during their follow-up meeting. His colleagues speak highly of him, and he's never had a single incident or complaint filed against him. This resignation appears to be entirely motivated by his desire to protect Prince George from any potential consequences. The Queen had nodded thoughtfully. And where is Sergeant Mitchell now? He's taken a flat in London, Your Majesty. From what I understand, he's considering several employment opportunities in private security, though none have been finalized. It was then that the Queen made a decision that surprised Halifax. I want to meet with Sergeant Mitchell personally. Such direct intervention by the monarch in personnel matters was unusual, but Halifax recognized that this situation had moved beyond routine administrative issues. The Queen's request was arranged discreetly, with Thomas receiving a formal invitation to return to the palace for a private audience. Thomas had been both honored and apprehensive about the meeting. He had never spoken directly with Queen Elizabeth during his years of service, though he had been in her presence countless times during official functions and family gatherings. The invitation suggested that the circumstances of his resignation had reached the highest levels of palace attention. The meeting took place in the Queen's private office, the same room where she had listened to Prince George's confession. Thomas entered in civilian clothes, having left his uniform behind when he departed his position. The Queen gestured for him to sit, and the formal atmosphere was immediately tempered by her direct and personal approach. "Sergeant Mitchell," she had begun, "I understand you left your position rather suddenly. I'd like to hear your account of the events that led to that decision." Thomas had been prepared for this moment, having rehearsed various versions of his explanation during the sleepless nights since his resignation. However, facing the monarch directly, he chose to be completely honest about his motivations and the conflict he had experienced. He explained how he had witnessed Prince George's spontaneous act of charity toward Harold Pembridge, and how he had struggled with the knowledge that such behavior, while admirable, technically violated several protocols governing royal interactions with staff members. He described his sleepless nights weighing his duty to report the incident against his desire to protect a young prince who had acted purely from compassion. "I couldn't bring myself to file a report that might get His Highness in trouble for being kind to someone who needed help," Thomas had said. "But I also couldn't continue in my position knowing I was keeping information from my superiors." Resigning seemed like the only honorable option. The Queen had listened to his explanation with the same careful attention she had given to Prince George's account. When Thomas finished speaking, she had remained quiet for several moments, considering the integrity and moral courage his decision had required. "Sergeant Mitchell," she had said finally, "in your 15 years of service, how would you assess Prince George's character and development?" The question had allowed Thomas to speak about something he was passionate about. He described George's natural kindness, his curiosity about the world beyond the palace walls, and his intuitive understanding of how to treat people with dignity and respect, regardless of their position. He spoke about the prince's genuine interest in the lives of the palace staff and his growing awareness of his future responsibilities. "His Highness has a rare quality, Your Majesty," Thomas had said. "He sees people as individuals first, not just as their roles or positions. That's what led him to help Mr. Pembridge, and I believe it will make him an exceptional king someday." The Queen had smiled at this assessment. "And yet you felt his natural compassion was something that needed to be hidden?" Thomas had paused, realizing that the Queen's question went to the heart of his dilemma. "Not hidden, Your Majesty, but perhaps channeled more appropriately. I was concerned that his spontaneous generosity might create complications he wasn't old enough to understand." "I see," the Queen had said. "And what if I told you that we've found an appropriate way to address Mr. Pembridge's situation that honors Prince George's desire to help while following proper procedures?" Thomas had been relieved to learn about the Employee Hardship Fund solution and Prince George's role in writing the formal recommendation. The elegant resolution demonstrated exactly the kind of guidance he had hoped the prince would receive, but hadn't known how to provide without potentially getting him in trouble first. The conversation had then taken an unexpected turn when the Queen addressed the matter of Thomas's resignation directly. "Sergeant Mitchell," she had said, "your loyalty to Prince George and your desire to protect him from the consequences of his own compassion speaks well of your character. However, I believe you made an error in judgment." Thomas had braced himself for criticism, but the Queen's next words surprised him. The error was not in recognizing the complexity of the situation, but in assuming that the royal family would punish a child for showing kindness. Your resignation, while well-intentioned, deprived Prince George of a mentor who clearly understood and appreciated his character. The Queen had gone on to explain her perspective on the incident. Rather than seeing George's spontaneous charity as a problem to be corrected, she viewed it as evidence of the values the family had tried to instill in him. The challenge was not to suppress such impulses, but to help him learn appropriate ways to act on them. Prince George needs advisors who understand that his compassion is a strength, not a weakness, she had said. People who can help him channel that compassion effectively, rather than simply enforce rigid protocol. What followed was an offer that Thomas hadn't expected. Rather than simply accepting his resignation, the Queen proposed that he return to his position with an expanded role in Prince George's development. In addition to his security responsibilities, he would be tasked with helping the prince understand how to balance his natural generosity with the practical requirements of his royal position. "I want Prince George to learn from someone who appreciates his character and can help him develop the judgment he'll need as a future king," the Queen had explained. "Your handling of this situation, including your ultimate decision to resign rather than betray his trust, suggests you're exactly the kind of person who should be guiding him." Thomas had been deeply moved by the offer and the trust it represented. The Queen was not only welcoming him back but was expanding his responsibilities to include elements of mentorship that went beyond traditional protection duties. However, accepting the position would require him to return to the complex situation he had tried to escape through resignation. He would need to work with Prince George while knowing about the incident. But now, with the Queen's explicit support for helping the prince navigate similar situations in the future, the decision would prove to be easier than Thomas had anticipated, largely because of Prince George's reaction when he learned that Thomas might be returning. Prince George's reaction to the news that Thomas might return was immediate and heartfelt. When Queen Elizabeth had mentioned during their weekly meeting that Sergeant Mitchell was being considered for reinstatement, the young prince's face had lit up with genuine joy. "Really, Granny? He could come back?" George had asked, his voice filled with hope. The Queen had smiled at her great-grandson's enthusiasm. "That depends on several factors, George. But tell me, why is Sergeant Mitchell's return so important to you?" George had thought carefully before answering, demonstrating the thoughtfulness that had impressed so many adults in his life. "He understands things," George had said finally. "When I wanted to help Mr. Pembridge, he didn't tell me I was wrong. He looked worried, but I think he was worried for me, not about me." Does that make sense? The distinction George had drawn was perceptive beyond his years, and the Queen had recognized it as such. Thomas had indeed been concerned about protecting George from potential consequences, rather than disapproving of his compassionate impulse. "He makes me feel like I can be myself," George had continued. "Like it's okay to care about people, even when it might be complicated." This conversation had reinforced the Queen's belief that Thomas Mitchell was exactly the kind of mentor Prince George needed during his formative years. The bond between them was built on mutual respect and understanding, with Thomas appreciating George's character while providing the guidance necessary to help him navigate the complexities of royal life. The formal process of reinstating Thomas required several administrative steps and consultations with various palace departments. Commander Halifax had to review security protocols and staffing arrangements, while the royal household had to approve the expanded role that would include mentorship responsibilities alongside traditional protection duties. During this process, Thomas had spent considerable time reflecting on the Queen's offer and what accepting it would mean for his future. The expanded role represented an opportunity to have a more significant impact on Prince George's development, but it also carried greater responsibility and visibility within the palace hierarchy. He had also considered the practical implications of returning after his dramatic resignation. His colleagues would undoubtedly be curious about the circumstances that had led to both his departure and his reinstatement. However, the discretion that had characterized his original handling of the situation would need to continue, as the details of Prince George's spontaneous charity would remain confidential. Meanwhile, Harold Pembridge and his wife Margaret had been experiencing their own period of adjustment. The assistance from the Royal Employee Hardship Fund had provided crucial financial relief, allowing Margaret to continue her medical treatment without the stress of overwhelming expenses. However, both Harold and Margaret remained deeply grateful to Prince George for his initial gesture of kindness. Harold had returned to his gardening duties with renewed energy and purpose. The resolution of his family's financial crisis had lifted a tremendous burden from his shoulders, and he found himself working with even greater dedication to maintain the castle grounds. When he encountered Prince George during the prince's walks around the estate, their interactions carried a special warmth that acknowledged their shared experience. "How is Mrs. Pembridge feeling?" George would ask during these encounters, and Harold would provide updates on his wife's progress with genuine appreciation for the prince's continued concern. These conversations had become more comfortable for Harold, now that the situation had been resolved through proper channels. He no longer carried the weight of accepting unauthorized assistance from a member of the royal family, but he would never forget the compassion that had motivated the prince's original gesture. The palace staff had begun to notice positive changes in the overall atmosphere as word spread discreetly about Thomas's potential return. While the specific details remained confidential, there was a general sense that a valued colleague would be rejoining their ranks, which boosted morale among the protection officers and household staff. Prince George's behavior during this period also reflected his anticipation of Thomas's return. His tutors noticed that he seemed more engaged and optimistic, and his interactions with other staff members carried a warmth that suggested he was looking forward to resuming his friendship with his former protection officer. The formal announcement of Thomas's reinstatement came during a routine staff meeting, presented as a straightforward administrative decision, without elaboration on the unusual circumstances involved. Thomas's colleagues welcomed him back professionally, though several privately wondered about the brief period of his absence and the timing of his return. On the morning of his first day back, Thomas had arrived at the palace early to review any changes in procedures or protocols that had been implemented during his absence. Commander Halifax had briefed him on his expanded responsibilities, emphasizing that his new role would require balancing traditional security duties with opportunities to provide guidance and mentorship to Prince George. "Your job is not just to protect his physical safety," Halifax had explained, "but to help him develop the judgment and wisdom he'll need to navigate increasingly complex situations as he grows older." This mandate represented a significant evolution from the traditional role of royal protection officers, who were typically expected to maintain professional distance from their charges. Thomas's new position acknowledged that Prince George's development required advisors who could appreciate his character while helping him understand the practical implications of his royal status. When Prince George first saw Thomas waiting outside the classroom after his morning tutorial session, the prince's smile was radiant. The reunion was professionally appropriate but personally meaningful, with both understanding that their relationship had been strengthened by the challenges they had navigated together. "I'm glad you're back, Sergeant Mitchell," George had said simply, but the sincerity in his voice conveyed the depth of his feelings. "I'm glad to be back, Your Highness," Thomas had replied. "Shall we take a walk in the garden? I believe you have some free time before your next appointment." As they walked through the castle grounds, passing by Harold Pembridge, who was tending to the rose garden with evident contentment, both Prince George and Thomas understood that they had learned valuable lessons from their shared experience. George had discovered that his impulse to help others was not something to be ashamed of, but rather a quality that needed to be channeled appropriately. Thomas had learned that protecting Prince George meant more than ensuring his physical safety. It meant helping him develop into the kind of person who could use his position and influence to make a positive difference in the world. The foundation had been laid for a mentoring relationship that would prove crucial during Prince George's teenage years, when the challenges of balancing personal convictions with royal responsibilities would become increasingly complex. Their shared understanding of the importance of compassion, combined with practical wisdom about how to exercise that compassion effectively, would guide Prince George's development into the kind of leader. 6 months after Thomas Mitchell's return to his position, the true measure of the lessons learned from the Harold Pembridge incident would be tested in ways that no one could have anticipated. Prince George's character had continued to develop under Thomas's expanded mentorship, but the real proof of his growth would come through his handling of a new situation that arose during a routine visit to a local children's hospital. The visit to St. Mary's Children's Hospital in London was part of Prince George's gradually increasing public duties. At 11 years old, he was beginning to take on carefully selected engagements that would help prepare him for his future role, while allowing him to contribute meaningfully to charitable causes. The hospital visit was intended to be a straightforward affair, a tour of the facilities, meetings with young patients, and a presentation to highlight the royal family's support for pediatric health care. Thomas had accompanied Prince George on the visit, along with the usual complement of protection officers and palace staff. The morning had proceeded according to schedule, with George demonstrating the natural ease with children that had become one of his notable characteristics. He had played games with young patients, listened to their stories, and shown genuine interest in their experiences. It was during the visit to the hospital's long-term care ward that Prince George encountered a situation that would test everything he had learned about balancing compassion with appropriate action. Among the children he met was 8-year-old Emma Richardson, a bright and articulate girl who was receiving treatment for a rare condition that required expensive experimental therapy, not covered by the National Health Service. Emma's mother, Sarah Richardson, had been at her daughter's bedside for weeks, having taken unpaid leave from her job as a nurse to care for Emma during this critical phase of treatment. The financial strain on the family was evident to anyone who looked closely, though Sarah had done her best to maintain a positive demeanor for her daughter's sake. During their conversation, Emma had mentioned to Prince George that she was worried about her mother, who seemed sad even when she tried to smile. With the intuitive understanding that children often possess, Emma had sensed her mother's stress about the mounting medical bills and the family's precarious financial situation. Prince George had listened to Emma's concerns, with the same careful attention he had shown to Harold Pembridge months earlier. However, this time, instead of acting on his immediate impulse to help, he had remembered the lessons learned from his previous experience. "That sounds very difficult for your family," George had said to Emma. "Sometimes when people we love are worried, it makes us worried too." After completing the hospital visit and returning to the palace, Prince George had sought out Thomas for a private conversation. The young prince had clearly been thinking about Emma and her family's situation during the drive back to Windsor Castle. "Sergeant Mitchell," George had said, "I met a girl today whose family is struggling with medical expenses, just like Mr. Pembridge's family was. But this time I think I know the right way to help." Thomas had been impressed by Prince George's approach to the situation. Rather than acting impulsively, the prince had recognized a parallel to his previous experience and was seeking guidance on how to respond appropriately. "What are you thinking, Your Highness?" Thomas had asked, encouraging George to work through his reasoning. "Well," George had said thoughtfully, "I could write a letter to the hospital's charity fund, recommending Emma's family for assistance. And maybe I could ask Granny if there are other ways the royal family supports families in situations like this." The solution Prince George had proposed demonstrated remarkable growth in his understanding of how to channel his compassionate impulses through appropriate channels. Instead of offering personal money or making unauthorized promises, he was thinking systematically about existing mechanisms that could provide help while maintaining proper boundaries. Thomas had praised George's thoughtful approach and had helped him draft a formal letter to the hospital's Patient Assistance Fund. The letter had been written in George's own words but had followed proper protocol, with copies provided to the appropriate palace staff to ensure transparency and accountability. Additionally, Prince George had requested a meeting with Queen Elizabeth to discuss broader questions about royal involvement in charitable healthcare initiatives. This conversation had led to a valuable learning opportunity about the various ways the royal family supported medical charities and how individual cases could be addressed through established philanthropic structures. The hospital's Patient Assistance Fund had quickly approved aid for Emma's family, providing the financial support needed to continue her experimental treatment. More importantly, the case had been handled in a way that protected both the Richardson family's dignity and Prince George's position, while still allowing him to make a meaningful difference in their lives. Word of Prince George's mature handling of the situation had reached Queen Elizabeth, who had been delighted by her great-grandson's growth and development. During their next weekly meeting, she had commended him for his thoughtful approach and his willingness to seek guidance rather than acting alone. "You've learned to use your heart and your head together," she had told him. "That's the mark of someone who will lead with both wisdom and compassion." The success of this approach had established a pattern that would serve Prince George well in future situations. Thomas had worked with him to develop a systematic way of evaluating requests for help or situations where assistance might be needed, ensuring that the prince's natural generosity could be expressed through appropriate channels. Meanwhile, the relationship between Prince George and the palace staff had evolved in positive ways. Harold Pembridge continued to encounter the prince during his work around the castle grounds, and their interactions had become a source of warmth and mutual respect. Harold's wife Margaret had made excellent progress in her treatment, and the family's gratitude to Prince George remained profound but appropriately expressed. The broader palace community had also benefited from the resolution of the original crisis. Staff members had observed how the situation had been handled with sensitivity and fairness, reinforcing their confidence in the royal family's commitment to treating employees with dignity and support. during difficult times. Thomas Mitchell's expanded role had proven successful beyond expectations. His ability to mentor Prince George while maintaining his security responsibilities had created a model that palace officials were considering for other young members of the royal family. The combination of protection and guidance provided exactly the kind of comprehensive support that royal children needed as they developed their understanding of their responsibilities and opportunities. As Prince George approached his 12th birthday, the lessons learned from the Harold Pembridge incident had become foundational to his character development. He had retained his natural compassion and desire to help others, but had learned to express these qualities in ways that were sustainable, appropriate, and effective. The young prince had also developed a deeper appreciation for the systems and structures that existed within the monarchy to channel royal influence toward positive ends. Rather than seeing protocol as an obstacle to helping people, he had come to understand it as a framework that could amplify his ability to make a difference while protecting everyone involved. The story of Prince George's secretive move that shocked the royal guard had ultimately become a story of growth, learning, and the development of wisdom. What had begun as a simple act of childhood kindness had evolved into a sophisticated understanding of how compassion and responsibility could work together to create lasting positive change. For Thomas Mitchell, the decision to leave his post had led not to the end of his career, but to its transformation into something more meaningful than he could have imagined. His willingness to prioritize Prince George's well-being over his own professional security had ultimately earned him a role in shaping the character of a future king. The incident had demonstrated that sometimes the most shocking moves are those motivated by the deepest care, and that the most profound changes come not from abandoning our principles, but from learning to express them more wisely and effectively.